Hello, everybody. Welcome to Science, Technology in the Future. We've got Pramod Nayar here, and you're an academic.
I'm at the University of Hyderabad, and I teach in the Department of English.
Fantastic. And you've written a very interesting book. Firstly, I read an article of yours. It was based on human and post-human rights, and then I found your book. So, yeah, I found it very interesting. I've read nearly all of it, except the last half of the last chapter. But I had to quickly skim because I ran out of time. So fantastic. Thanks for being here. But I guess I should ask, what got you interested in post-human studies?
I've had interest in things like the superhero in comics, but also in mythology. And it seemed to me that there was already an incipient posthuman stance in many of these by showing things that evolve beyond the human, things that exceed the limitations of the human form when you look at superheroes. It's pharmacological or technological intervention that enables them to do so. And then reading people like Donna Haraway and the cyborg paradigms from several of these theorists, and of course in science fiction, you begin to see that there is a lot more going on there than just Batman as a superhero, as post-human. So that's how I started reading around this, and the discovery of books from the Posthumanities series that Carrie Wolf edits from Minnesota. It was a whole new world, in fact, but also for me, it was interesting coming at it from a post-colonial angle for a different set of reasons, where post-colonial thinkers like Fanon and others had already offered major critiques of the humanist mode of thinking and the enlightened legacies that it hinged upon and built on. And the linkage between humanist thinking, but also colonialism and the racialized discourse of colonialism, to me showed that there was a severe limitation on how humanism treated the idea of the human and what it evolved into. So there were two strands, you can say, in my initial forays into the post-human. One was the pop cyborg route into this, which I already mentioned, and the mythic stories that built around advanced humans and films that did that as well. The other was the very clear critical race theory, post-colonial theory critique of traditional humanism, and that whenever the category the human was invoked or the universalized model of the human was invoked, it was always partial and exclusionary. And to me, that seemed at that point in time a very important insight, that what we thought of as universal model was actually not so. And even things like the civilizational mission and others, we will look at them again, these again in a bit. These missions and projects were themselves hinged upon a very hierarchic, exclusionary, discriminatory structuration of life forms. So among the humans, you had a hierarchy of ethnicities and groups and races. And then, of course, looking at posthumanism, you realize that this was extended to other forms of life. So my approach came from two basic sources, you might say: the pop cultural introduction to models of transhuman forms and superheroes and superhumans, and the critical race theory's interest in what the category of the human itself had meant in history. Yeah.
Well, let's define the terms, because a lot of people, a lot of futurists believe posthumanism refers to something that just comes like an advanced form of transhumanism. It's like, once we migrate onto nanotechnology swarms, foglets or whatever, then maybe we're no longer a species definition of human. So how about let's define the terms of what you consider the differences are between transhumanism and posthumanism.
I think you've said it quite well in your comment itself, that when we look at the transhuman model and how it is called quote-unquote advance. That itself is a very interesting position to take, because if you assume the human is a construct of biological, theological, medical, and other discourses, it's deemed to possess some features which are quote-unquote natural, and some are via training and additional attributes that come through enculturation, training, and competencies that are acquired through various social processes. And with technological advancement, it would say that the transhuman appears as some form whose competencies have been enhanced beyond that of the average human. All these terms are, of course, under question. What do we understand as the average human? Because measurements of any of the competencies, whether it's intelligence or physical strength, has cultural connotations and cultural frames. So the distinction that we are looking at here is that the transhumanists believe we can exceed the limitations of the human form. But the posthuman vision is not just about enhancement of abilities. It is not just a question of saying people will be born with higher IQs and therefore will be able to do a lot more with their intelligence than anybody else in human history. I think central to the vision is the relationship between humans, technology, other life forms, and non-living matter. So it displaces the idea of the human as being at the center of the world, or that the human is a sovereign, autonomous, coherent entity. So I think that vision is quite substantially different from the transhumanist one. Yes, it does indicate that we might exceed ourselves, our abilities, but that's not the sole, I don't know whether to use the word goal, but yeah, it serves for present. That the posthuman vision is one that expands what we understand as the human itself, not just advance what we are now. Because for the transhuman, in my view, what happens is we still think of the human from where advancement begins. And it's a kind of upgrading of the model we have evolved into at this point in time. For the posthuman, that's not the only attribute. There are several other things going on. And that, like I said, the key is to see the idea of the human as no longer autonomous, bounded. The question of co-evolution or cohabitation with other species cosmopolitanism, are as central to the posthuman as technological advancement of the human form. So I think those are the key markers for us.
Yeah, it's interesting. There seems to have been inherited an anthropocentric bias in the transhumanist declaration from maybe, I guess, like earlier humanist ideologies. Now, but there's a lot of strands of transhumanism, and all the people who went into actually forming the transhumanist declaration come from different angles. I guess that was supposed to be some sort of attempt at a meeting point. However, points 1 and 7 do share with what I believe a goal of posthumanism, and that is trying to achieve empathy and well-being for all sentient life. So I find that although it's a lot of the transhumanist declaration is worded using the word human flourishing and human like enhancement and all that, it really shouldn't just be the human who gets I guess the rewards from I guess the benefits of technological development. It should be like the system itself, and humans as part of that.
Absolutely, absolutely, and yes, exactly. But what you said is also I think an important launchpad for these two strands to come together, and that's the question of empathy that you brought in. And I think that's important because that is where posthumanism might have a conversation being set up with certain strands of the transhumanist project as well. And I think that's where it has to come together. And I think that will be fruitful also because when we use a term like the advanced human form or the advancement of humanity along particular directions, we are not speaking of corporeal improvement alone, but which values, whether it's corporeal or intellectual or emotional, empathy that you said, which are the values that we think ought to be advanced. And that's where I think it's important. So if, for example, like you correctly pointed out, if empathy is a cultural value that we would like advanced and enhanced in us, then that empathy would, I think, lead us to a position where we say that empathy is not about the human species, human types, human bodies alone. The empathy would be a much larger, has a much larger domain to operate in, which will include other life forms as well. So I think that's a very accurate way of thinking of a convergence, if convergence is the word I'm looking for. And I think that would bring together the one strand, well, a couple of strands of the transhumanist idea with the posthumanist vision. That would be, I think, really
Yes, I
fantastic.
agree. I mean, it'd be awesome to get you in conversation with people like James Hughes and David Pearce, who do
Yes.
share some of those values, but also
Yeah.
may have some differing opinions about the execution of achieving such a goal of having
But that's different. That's different and much more complicated, because if you think in terms of the division of the world along lines of economic or social or cultural value systems or equalities, then you already have a problem of trying to fine-tune it so that it fits a large number of large demographics. That's not going to be easy. Which is perhaps why many of the people who look at these think of it as a kind of utopian idealism, that you can actually bring together something like this fitting so many people, because cultural values, what is valued varies from culture to culture. Within the country like India itself, there's so much variation of what gets valued and what is not valued, whether it's the color of your skin, to your intellectual ability, to your ability or interest in empathizing. These change, and these are extremely varied. So when we say these are what we would like enhanced among humans, we are already running into the debate about what we. It's a bit like the Human Rights Declaration, when we say human dignity as the cornerstone, and the Human Rights document is predicated upon the idea of the individual as an autonomous single entity. But for many cultures around the world, we do not see the human as a single entity, because it's rather, well, it's not on the lines of I think, therefore I am, but I link, therefore I am. I am because we are. So there's a lot more of collective sense of the individual. Perhaps that's not the best way, felicitous way of phrasing it, but that will do for now. That we are looking at the human not as a single powerful entity at all. So when human rights depends upon having the idea of individuals and individual dignity, it doesn't work as effectively for the rest of for other cultures. So the same problem might arise here as to why does Adam Ford think that this is a value that can be enhanced? And Pramod Nayar would say, perhaps that's not the value that ought to be advanced given the context in which I live and work.
It's interesting, like the idea of a more collective organism sort of arising in the future, like some sort of like a good Borg, I guess imperialistic Borg, or some sort of like a hive mentality, because it seems as though, for me, like one of the things I think about is how close we are to our knowledge these days. All we need to do is just look something up, and this helps us remember these things. The idea that Andy Clark and David Chalmers, I think you mentioned Andy Clark in your book, with the extended mind hypothesis, is that we are not just this sort of skull-bound node of activity here, but we're constantly cognizing across the environment. And a lot of our achievements has been through collaboration in the form of shared cognition. So we're not just bouncing information off spreadsheets and non-sentient objects, but also other people and other, I guess, and also so to survive, other species.
Well,
so
yes, absolutely. I'm glad you brought it, Clark, because later Hales would talk about, Catherine Hales would speak about cognitive assemblages as well. But I was also thinking that when you look at the collective or the hive mind, It already exists in some form in the pre-technological era. Pre-technological, I mean technology as we understand it now, in terms of inherited abilities and inherited cognitive and cultural systems, which also constitute the knowledge on which I, as a child, would start building upon. So there is already a sense of the collective knowledge formation process within all of us. And cultural training is collective, and cultural training does work with your cognitive and hypercognitive abilities. So that's also being shaped continuously. What the contemporary technological era has done is it has accelerated this. But it's not that it didn't exist before.
Yeah.
I mean, we have all grown up within traditions of knowledge sharing. It may not have been that we were all Facebook generation or inherited or acquired knowledge via technological shared knowledges, but through other forms as well. So, for instance, song cultures in various parts of Africa, South America, and in Asia are forms of knowledge sharing as well, cultural knowledge being transmitted. So that also is a form of inheritance of knowledge. We may not think of these as technological, but they're certainly technique in that sense of crafted forms of knowledge being transmitted, so to speak. So it's been there. We, of course, now it's practically at the speed of light. That's, of course, it's a huge difference. I mean, it's practically instantaneous, isn't it?
Yeah, well, as long as it takes us to read something, I mean, we haven't got like a jack into our skulls injecting
Not yet.
information. We can't be a
Not
Neo and learn Kung Fu just by having downloaded the algorithm. Not yet.
Yeah,
Exactly.
not yet.
But, that could happen. Computers can learn something just by like copying and like code or copying a neural net or something like that. And
I'm sure somebody's working on it as we speak.
yeah, with Neuralink, maybe.
Yes.
Who knows? It's quite interesting though. When you have a look at the way humanities has evolved, you think that it needs like humanities needs some form of like a reconfiguration. Do you say? What's the actual quote? I've got you. It must be reinvented. You wrote about this in the Rise of the Posthumanities article.
We are already, I think, doing that in some ways, because I think for people who are alert within the humanities, of course, to think of what it has come to mean that we have, one, rejected the traditional value systems that humanism has always invoked and claimed to be universal. And the universal order of things built around that idea of the self has also changed now. So I think that's an important development within the humanities itself, that we recognize the limits of traditional humanist thought. The second is the humanities' fear of technology and what it sets out to do has abated a little bit. And we find more and more people working within the field of even things like philosophical humanities and things like that. And we know many of these. I'm sure they're figured on your reading and discussion list as well. And humanities has begun to see that there is a radical need to shift the idea of the humanities to something beyond the human. That there is not enough substance to the argument that we remain centralized as the centerpiece of the world. So at some point, you've cited Savulescu's work on moral enhancement.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I think Savulescu's work, I personally find it extremely insightful. Primarily because it relates to the novelist I like most for these ones, Octavia Butler, whom also you've cited. Moral enhancement would, I think, be something that the new humanities would be interested in, because where it has unfortunately echoes of a colonial past, because the civilizational project was about upliftment of the moral and cultural values of the barbarian nations and cultures. Yes, it was there. When we say moral enhancement, as Savulescu thinks about it, via pharmacological or technological intervention, of course. We are thinking of the ability to think through extremely complicated aphoretic moral issues. So rather than just have the enhancement of rational reasoned processes of thinking through, we might have to add other layers to problem solving. So it cannot be just that you are a super genius mind who's able to offer rational solutions to problems, but somebody who would tether that to moral concerns as well. I think that's important. So I would say that there is a clear case for linking moral enhancement, as Julian Savulescu proposes it, with other kinds of enhancement. And even if you're thinking in terms of posthuman bodies or minds, we are looking at a humanities which reinvents it around these two forms of enhancement.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned colonialism. I'm not sure that everybody understands what you might mean by that.
Yeah, sure. I'm thinking of colonialism as an instance of imperial domination of one race over another. And I'm looking at the histories of Africa, Asia, primarily under European rule. And what makes it so troubling, shall we say, for contemporary visions of enlightenment or 18th century humanism. And that's to do with the very clear hierarchization and racialization of the human world, which it relied upon. So that's why humanities, when we look at traditional humanism, clearly rejects that position. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, important for us to recognize as well.
And it seems as though there's some aspects of the Enlightenment humanism which the critical posthumanists don't agree with. Mirandola, who was like one of the forefathers, said that human dignity was based on rationality, or something along those lines. But it seems as though there may be some aspects to rationality in its traditional and cultural sense, which might not make sense anymore. However, the aspects of critical thinking and science and trying to test things and I guess justify and rationalize them rather than just take knowledge as a product of received wisdom, maybe from a god or some sort of divine source, seemed to be a step in the right direction. And what makes it difficult for me to reject rationality is rejecting that would require that we'd have to reject all the possible or all the progress that we've made with science and rationality that is beneficial. So it seems like it's not just...
there's no doubt about that. For example, when I said that we are looking at, say, human rights also in new perspectives because of our understanding now that it's based on a particular model of the human, it also implies a critical questioning of all that has necessarily followed from that position, that stance towards the human. So yes, to abandon the advantages that enlightenment has given us, notably the idea of human dignity, would not quite be a right step in my view, because it jeopardizes all that has been worked towards and achieved in however minimal fashion for, say, women or the varied races and ethnic groups on earth. So that would not be, but that's precisely that conundrum illustrates what I'm trying to say, that which values are valuable across the world for all people is a matter of considerable debate. So when we say, oh, Enlightenment humanism is all about racialized colonial projects, no, not entirely. That would be, like I said, annihilating everything that has been worked towards for past century and a half or more, and whatever gains have accrued from it being thrown out. No. But then we also will find it difficult, I think, to come to an agreement, conclusive agreement, as to what we understand are shared human values or cultural values. It will require a lot of work. It will require a lot of discussion, yes. And when, for instance, Savulescu, James Hughes, Nick Bostrom, of course, I seem to have dropped his name before. I've not used his name before yet. Are thinking about those ones. And when you align it to the work of someone like Peter Singer, Judith Butler. Judith Butler and others, we are looking at an attempt towards a dialogue of that sort. So is, for example, vulnerability rather than dignity usable as a concept that brings everybody under one label? We don't quite know. It's still very early, because if you look at the responses to someone like Judith Butler's argument about grievable lives and vulnerability, they've all not been uniform either, isn't it? And when you look at philosophers like Ethel Membe and others writing on necropolitics and the post-colony, again, the production of life and the production of death are not uniform across the world. So therefore, if you say life or dignity or vulnerability as the cornerstone of any of such theoretical philosophical edifice, such as posthumanism, it will still remain open to a lot of discussion. So, but it's vital we do that, is the point. The position that everything is ultimately relative is as dangerous as a rigid code that says only this counts or only that counts.
So, I mean, I guess a lot of people might just take the critical posthumanist stance as rejecting rationality and think, hey, that's silly. So, yeah.
It's not as simple as that. It's a little worrying when people say, oh, that means we can dump all rationality. No, that's not quite the way we go about it. Yeah.
There's a lot of art and literature in the post-humanities. Now, Stellark, who you have cited in your book and also in your article, lives just around the corner from me, kind of like a few suburbs away. But I've known him now for about 10 years.
Is it somebody else now?
No, it's Stellark, definitely. He's always well, he still refers to himself as Stellark. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, he's still got an ear on his arm, and he still does a lot of interesting art projects. And he spoke at one of our meetings late last year. So, yeah, we're looking at this the idea of rethinking the idea of monstrosity, which you wrote about in your book, where it's often a term that people use to describe things which they don't quite understand but are scared of, right? And there's maybe they'll look at these possible futures or these possible morphologies of humans or life forms in the future and see, well, that's monstrous, and it might initiate a kind of yuck response to this sort of progress.
Difference has always been labeled monstrous.
Yes.
Anything that looks different, behaves differently, or thinks differently is monstrous. So the equation of difference with something wicked or wild or unacceptable or deviant, is itself conceptual sleight of hand, which says, I don't understand you, so you must be terrifying, or I find you repulsive and therefore you're terrifying. The equation of difference with fear, or the kind of normative judgments that are invoked to say people with this shape of body or this way of thinking are monstrous, is itself being called into question. So when you look at Kevin Warwick or Stellark, wearable technologies, when they first started doing this, was still way off on the horizon. And now it's routine with even ordinary things like wearable devices such as say, Google Glass or things like that. Wearable technologies have become intrinsic to what we are. So the monstrous, shall we say, gets absorbed over a period of time and gets normalized. So what sets out as radically different when Kevin Warwick did that, or Stellark grew an extra arm and an extra ear and things like that, was at that point against the normative definitions and appearance of the human. So you look at, as you said, the yuck factor was invoked and said, oh, that's absolutely abhorrent. And then you discover that it does something for you when you incorporate it into your life as a technological addition to what you are. And you begin to understand it better. We are all assemblages anyway. It's a question of how much of it is routinized, shall we say, in our lives now. And when that happens, it's no longer monstrous. Till Warwick does something else.
Yeah. So, let's talk about the future of genetic engineering, human cloning, and what
Mhm.
maybe post-human bodies might look like, and what it might mean for post-human rights or human rights and species rights. How would our changing morphology interfere with, or maybe bring up new opportunities for reevaluating rights?
Well, I think it will be inevitable that we do this, that uh, when the nature, form, morphology, abilities of the human are now more or less achieved or put into effect through an assemblage of technological devices, um, how much of us remains the normative human is itself doubtful. So if we say that all humans have human rights, and people have talked about it via Peter Singer and others, that if we say sentience or consciousness of or rationality about things are a threshold within which we define the human, then people like Cavalieri and Peter Singer have noted that there are many among us who have not been able to meet that threshold for various reasons, either from disease or congenital defects or accidents and injuries or whatever. Would that at that point make them lesser persons? So the problem, as we have to address it, would be the definition of the person has itself changed. It will necessarily, like I said, take us towards theology and biomedicine and bioethics and a whole lot of disciplines put together. But the notion of the person has itself changed. What about persons who are assemblages with machines and live because the machines help them survive, who perform their necessary functions to keep them alive, who are not enhanced but being kept alive at that plane, uh, thanks to machines and chemicals and assemblages? When you look at someone like Jean-Luc Nancy writing about the intruder heart, he says that he's now more or less Nancy because his bodily processes are embedded in a whole assemblage of wires and cables and machines and nurses and appurtenances of the biomedical kind. So how much of a human is that person, that body? So I don't really have answers about where the position of rights would go on this particular issue. But if we have always critiqued humanism for defining some humans as possessing a lesser life and other life forms being, quote, lower life forms, then would people like this, would humans like this, dependent upon machines, still be acceptable as persons? So post-human rights will, by definition, have to begin by asking what we understand as a person. Are assemblages persons? What degree of assemblage would count as redefining the human person? If 80% of your bodily functions are being run by machinery, implants, and various pharmacological interventions, then are you still human as we have traditionally understood it? Are you an enhanced human? Are you an assemblage? Are you a machine human congeries? If so, would you deserve rights? So those are value judgments in addition to everything else. So post-human rights are also about value judgments at some point, which will require the kinds of debates that philosophers like Singer, Cavalieri, James Hughes, Savulescu, and others are launching. Also, people working within literature and culture, such as Donna Haraway and Carrie Wolf, are also doing.
You're probably aware that there was a conference earlier in this decade called "Personhood Beyond the Human."
Yes. I didn't follow it, but I was aware of it. Yes. So that's precisely it, isn't it? That we are trying to figure out at what point does the embryo acquire the status of a pre-person, and at what point in persistent vegetative state does the person stop being a person? Tom Kitwood's work and Stephen Sabat's work on dementia and the dementing process also argue that, most of it argues that people will say Alzheimer's or in later stages of Alzheimer's are persons if you define the person differently, that they may have lost certain levels of memory recall abilities, but is memory what defines us? Suppose we say it is, then yes, they are no longer persons. But if memory is not the determining factor of what we are as persons and who we are as the persons we have recognized, then perhaps things will change. So Stephen Sabat, Tom Kitwood, they're as crucial to the critical humanist project, I would think, if you look at those writing around Alzheimer's and dementia. So I think that has not come into the picture yet when you look at critical posthumanism, but it might be a useful convergence point again.
I guess, like, being a bit speculative about the future, I've read some of David Brin's novels, and he wrote the Uplift series. I didn't read all of it, but it's fascinating, the idea. But it's also not just the idea that we will uplift other animal life forms, but the idea that maybe if we do develop some form of AI, it may uplift us, or like uplift us, maybe in a form of moral enhancement, or maybe in other forms, give us, like, you know, a longer life, or some form of like a other augmentation that we may see as desirable. I guess the difference is that we would be making decisions about moral animals as currently we consider them as moral patients, and not moral actors. We'd be maybe uplifting them to a status of a moral actor, and that could be very interesting too. I just want to get your view.
I think you put your finger on it about questions of moral actants and agents, which implies automatically the ability to carry out what you aspire to reach. So it's not a question of just aspiration, but the ability to put into motion the processes that are required to fulfill the goals that you have set yourself. So yes, the question of agency will again hinge on questions of what we believe are appropriate aspirations and goals for different life forms, ourselves included. So if, like you said, moral enhancement or advancement is a goal we all agree upon, what does that make us into? When people like Ian Hacking talk about making up people, you know, the question would be, what are the discourses through which we make up certain kinds of people? Ian Hacking notes that in 1955, there were no people with multiple personality disorders. In 2000, there are so many million. Because in 1955, there was no idea, there was no discourse, there was no biomedical philosophical speculation on what we mean by MPD. In 50 years' time, we have, so as I also said, in 1940, there were no high-functioning autists. In 2005, there are so many million high-functioning autists. We have made up people. So I think that Hacking argument is central, again, like I said, alongside people working in dementia studies and gerontology, as to would enhancement mean only longer life? Point one. Point two, if not, what else should that longer life contain, such as, say, agency, ability, the capacity to work towards the goals you have set yourself. So yeah, that I think is important, and it's part of the debate.
And the debate could include, like, what does it mean to have welfare or to flourish? And so it can't
following
be just,
from that, yes.
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine, David Pearce, I think that we have the moral obligation to eliminate suffering, to completely eliminate suffering, and to make everybody happier. So first, I mean, he's a negative utilitarian, so he believes that's the overriding obligation, is to eliminate suffering. And then later as a project, or maybe at the same time, also increase happiness.
Yes,
but it's unclear as to me is what happiness really is. It just the raw feeling of happiness? Is there one dimension there, or is there many dimensions to being happy, or achieving a state of, or higher states of well-being?
Yes, and following from the point you just made, should there be a social drive towards enhancing happiness? Should it be state-funded? Is it like elective surgery, or is it standard pattern of funding from, say, insurance and other institutionalized state structures that will help enhance happiness? Would it be part of, in other words, the welfare universe? Is welfare inclusive of mental well-being of people? you
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Well, some countries seem to measure how well they're doing by gross domestic happiness. I mean, there's more
Yes, there is
to
a
it
World
than just
Happiness
that
Index.
slogan, but yeah,
Yeah, there is a
it's
World Happiness Index.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I
which
find
does
that very
that. Yeah.
fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah, I personally, I think I intuit that yes, I believe that it should be something which should be institutionalized because it seems to be like a common good, and it seems to be
Mhm.
like something you can enhance for everybody a lot easier, and you can
Mhm.
just do it for one person. It's one of those
Mhm.
sort of things that could be made to scale. Yeah,
Mhm.
so
Yeah, made to scale, yes. And accounting for differences in how people define happiness for themselves and for the community.
right, that's a
Yeah,
good point.
yeah.
Yeah. So, as you know, I spoke to Anders Sandberg, and
Mhm.
he gave me some feedback about what I should ask during this interview. And he
That's kind of tricky. I mean, Sandberg getting you to ask the questions he wanted to ask.
well, yeah, I mean, like I asked him to. So, well, I
Uh-huh.
just put it on a forum, and he responded. So,
Right.
yeah, so he thinks that there is some disagreement and not getting along between transhumanists and posthumanists, but believes also that there can be a win-win vision that we can
Mhm.
all work towards. So I'm not sure, like what you think, but there seems to be no. He said that there seems to be no fundamental reason why both perspectives couldn't simultaneously get what they want. So yeah, yeah. So was just
So
wondering
I
what your
agree.
thoughts were.
I agree. I like Sandberg's work on brain emulation and things like that. You know, I think he's really onto something with the work he's doing. But yes, I don't think there is any reason for us to believe or visualize why these two strands can't come together. And there is some conversation going, and
Of course.
the work you've cited, like James Hughes and others, are, I think, incorporating the transhumanists and anticipating or incorporating transhumanist issues within what they're trying to do as well. So I think there is something like a conversation already underway, and I think it's a stimulating conversation. See, the enhancement of the human can involve, at least theoretically speaking, the enhancement of the kinds of values and attributes we believe will enable, say, greater compassion and not just greater intelligence and greater problem-solving process. And that, I mean, not all of us need to do higher mathematics to be better human beings or better citizens. And it's not mandatory that we understand Richard Rorty or Paul Ricoeur to become better humans. I mean, our citizenship of the world does not depend on our being able to read abstruse philosophical tracts, does it?
Mhm.
So can we evolve non-hierarchic thinking, which in the mind would refuse a hierarchization of life forms, which was the bane of Enlightenment humanism. So when Sandberg and Nick Bostrom spoke about cognitive enhancement, they spoke as a recall. I've not revisited the paper for a while now. I think it's an early 2004, 2005 paper.
Mm.
They spoke of, as a recall, core faculties of the mind, and that the enhancement of that would be something they wanted to talk about. And it's now nearly 2 decades after that, and what if the ability to empathize is also a core faculty of the human mind?
Mm.
With mirror neuron theory, people are talking about the ability to empathize. And to return to Octavia Butler, she does posit a hyper-empath syndrome, to be able to empathize more with greater degree and with more people. So what if those are written into our vision as core faculties and not just, like I said, abstruse problem solving? Why should it not be a win-win situation, as Sandberg correctly puts it? I think it's a, if nothing else, it's a lovely vision to think about. And I definitely think that the question of ethical treatment of the other, or the compassion towards the other, or moral enhancement is integral to a posthumanist vision.
Hmm.
Mm.
Another concern that another member of Humanity Plus, or who's actually, I think, executive director at the moment, Natasha, thought that posthumanism was tethered to
Mhm.
postmodernism, and that was bad.
Mm.
But also said that a lot of transhumanist thinking was inspired by postmodernist thinkers early on. I guess Donna Haraway herself said that concedes that the only what we also need to be wary of the postmodern play of endless difference and relativism. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the postmodernist influence on posthumanist thinking and the good and the bad of it. And
I did mention, I think, early on in the conversation that to move towards an utter and complete relativism also does not fetch as much.
Yes.
So on the one hand, there is the Enlightenment, more or less rigid codes and ways of thinking, and then there is a complete relativism of the postmodern revolt against that form of thinking, and over reliance on fragmentation and the small and the petite histories and things like that. That I don't think quite serves the purpose. Well, yes. There is a considerable amount of emphasis on difference, and rightly so. But to push that far enough would mean to say that there cannot be the basis for any universal ideas of, say, moral enhancement or welfare, because ultimately it is possible to lapse into a kind of nihilism. I can't do anything about anything because it's not my area. It's not my, that also is. So I go with what people like Donna Haraway and Natasha have been arguing, that tethering it to a very postmodern impulse would also mean the destruction of what we know as the subject. A subject with agency, with capability, with aspirations. Because if all of it is just a play of discourse and being embedded in structures of power, then we are also denying the ability or the possibility of ability and agency to be enhanced in some form, unless we say that's also discursive. These are not quite just discursive and not quite just relative. At some point, if the Universal Declaration of Human Rights had to come to some kind of conclusion about what we all understand and take to be the human, we might also have to come to some kind of understanding as to what we mean by the posthuman. And it cannot all be converted into relativism. That does not take us very far. So I would go with both Natasha Whittemore and Donna Haraway on that.
Okay, cool. So what do you think in general postmodernism has to offer for posthumanism and, well, even transhumanism? What is it that...
I do think the question of grand narratives is definitely a problem. That grand narratives which do not account for difference is definitely a key concern. The reliance on certain forms of knowledge making is also not quite easy now any longer to quit. The breaking up of the subject as purely simulated fragmented creations within discourse is also not quite on. I understand the skepticism is that it shows is useful up to a point. So the rhetoric of postmodernism, which has a certain idea and attitude towards the subject, may not be very helpful. I think that's something we have to take into account. And you've cited, I think this is Natasha Whittemore's point about being tethered to postmodernism that you quoted, and the rhetoric on posthumanism, which is not does not show an adequate understanding of technology. Yes, that's very true. Because if we are to say that, if you are to acknowledge the fact that lives have changed because of technology, and we have a better understanding of technology, also the ethical problems of the technology, then I think the transhuman has been modified in a posthuman fashion, and that it's not just a blind adherence to technological codes and cultures. So it doesn't have to be an either or, basically. Yeah.
Cool. Well, it kind of reminds me of Kuhn's influence on the philosophy of science, where paradigm shifts often occurred when, one dominant scientist either quit or died, and then other scientists, were there to fill their shoes, but came along with their new ideas. I guess maybe asking the right questions of science requires a bit of a paradigm shift sometimes. You need a shift in perspective. You need to see things slightly differently to be to be asking the right questions in science, and also asking the right questions in ethics, and engineering the right things in order to achieve a better society. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, whether that, like, your thinking is being influenced by Thomas Kuhn's sort of thinking in philosophy of science at all.
Well, I didn't think so much of that. I've been working in and around with Ian Hacking and others, and I do agree with the basic premise here, but I also know that such questioning has already begun when people like Donna Haraway are addressing science, or, so you do see that ethical questions being asked, and moral questions being asked, or philosophical questions being asked of science, or say cloning and things like that, are really important. So, for instance, when the evolutionary biologists or scientists like Scott Gilbert are asking questions from the science point of view about what is life, you also have people like Donna Haraway asking questions about what is a species, what constitutes race, and what ought to be our ethical response to other forms of life, and the embeddedness of human forms, situated knowledges via Foucault and others. So those questions are being asked, and I think they are timely. Like people like Fatima Jackson asking questions about the Human Genome Project and its racialized implications. Those who are looking at the journey of man from Nat Geo and the attempt to trace genetic histories, the kind of genetic determinism that seems to be on the cards when you look at the search for a genetic answer to everything. Why do I look like this? What's the color of my hair based on this kind of gene? Is there a gene for this disease and that condition? There's a certain genetic racism that seems to be incipient in many of these. And people like Donna Haraway have cautioned us on that. And I think that caution is very important, because one cannot think of these as just being just things that happen in laboratories. We assimilate them into our everyday life. For instance, when Evelyn Fox Keller called her book The Century of the Gene, she was talking about this. I mean, think of, for everything now, we will have a phrase like, this is the DNA of. The phrase DNA has become part of everyday speech, a kind of lingua franca adapted from science. And it seems to me that it's an often uncritical appropriation of it without understanding. For example, geneticists will themselves tell you that genes get switched off and switched on based on environment, nutrition, a whole bunch of cultural factors, and it is not a sole determinant of what you become or what you are. Those cautions are being practiced by several of the scientists, and a lot of those cautions also proceed from philosophers, ethicists, who are asking certain kinds of unsettling questions. So if we were to go with only the biomedical model of the human, I think we won't go very far. So that's exactly the reason why these philosophers are asking us to understand what we mean by the human, what we understand as life, or thresholds of life and death. So I think the paradigms are being informed very clearly by philosophical thinking and ethical principles. Yes.
Indeed. Foucault, if I pronounced the name correctly, which I probably didn't, sort of spoke about this sort of impending doom of the human. You know, maybe we can consider that as the impending sort of takeover of posthumanism. But he said in The Order of Things, I think the closing remarks was that man would be erased like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of a sea. So for good or bad, do you think that human era would be left behind as for mere transient congeries in a network of other phenomena, perhaps in the form of extinction or through self-guided evolution?
I don't know whether you're asking this question just because we are in the middle of the COVID age. but jokes apart.
Existential risk is one of the things that transhumanists like to focus on.
I didn't get that, Adam. What was that?
existential and global catastrophic risks is one of the things that Nick Bostrom and a number of other transhumanists, Anders Sandberg, both working at the Future of Humanity Institute, like to focus on. So yes, it is something that's
well, yeah, I must confess that I've not followed the Future of the Human Institute's work in the recent past. I mean, it's been a while because of other work that I'm doing. So, but I should definitely catch up on what they're doing. But yes, the point is that ways of talking about the human have changed and changed drastically. So how we understand, conceptualize, and identify with the human will change. It's already underway. How much of it will change, to what effect, political, social, cultural, moral, that change will work, we are not yet clear. So acceptance of new forms of the human, new ways of talking about the human, work, they inspire some fear, some glee, some fascination, some awe. But we are, like I said, still early. But there is I think, maybe because of the pandemic or whatever it might be, we're beginning to understand that quite a lot of things have been wrong about how we have been as humans, ethically, morally speaking. And that might just be I'm not quite sure it's a tipping point, but it's definitely a kind of swerve towards other ways of talking about ourselves and thinking about ourselves. So that old form of the human, yes, is on the way out.
So a change in the way we think about ourselves. Do you think that'll have a lot to play into how we actually morphologically change? Like when transhumanists often think about this sort of thing, they think of like new features of the body, being able to sort of extend cognition, grow bigger brains, or grow wings, or have longer lives. Will this help? Will this
it will be part of it? Yes. Yes, it will be a part of it, how we evolve. For instance, in the wake of the pandemic, will we require to evolve into people with a different kind of morphological setup, so to speak, with the possibility of airborne pathogens being stopped? Do we incorporate technological devices to, I mean, we all wear masks when we go out, we need filtration devices and mechanisms. Will it eventually transform the way we breathe, for instance, and the way we go out into the open as opposed to staying in a closed room with air-conditioned, insulated, incubator-like settings? So there will be changes in the morphology. But as we all understand, it's incremental, it's slow. If, as Rob Nixon spoke about environmental violence and slow violence, because it takes place over a long period of time, this morphological change will also be slow. The paradigm shift about understanding human limitations might be a tad faster, driven by other necessities, other needs. Morphologically, yes, but I think the rethinking on the human is underway already, with or without enhancement of certain kinds, with or without changed morphological conditions. Yes. Yeah.
Do you believe that artificial superintelligence is possible?
I don't quite know whether I should or shouldn't believe that. I don't really have a very clear picture of the state of the technology and all that. I do think that connected intelligences and cognitive assemblages are already here with us. Human-machine assemblages and congeries, human-machine, animal thinking, shared cognition, shared situated cognitions, assemblages are already here. I'm not quite sure.
So you'd say that's a form of like superintelligence, would you?
I'm not going to commit myself to that.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not quite sure of everything within the artificial intelligence universe research of research. So I'm going to let that pass, and I'm not going to have you pin me down as a person who said yes, it is happening.
Sure. Well, I mean, you know that the idea of the singularity is something that transhumanists often think about. It's talked about so much and has been in the past that it seems to be part of the culture of transhumanism to sort of consider the possibility that we'll have like exponential growth and accelerating sort of increases in an AI's capability. What do you think about the phenomenon there of why people are thinking about this sort of thing, and how it sort of, I guess, steers the direction of transhumanist and maybe even posthumanist thinking?
You're talking about Kurzweil and others on technological singularity.
Yeah, so Kurzweil is like one of the biggest names who's helped sort of, I guess, popularize the idea. Of course, like Werner Vinge and others had thought of it earlier. Yeah.
Well, I like I said, I'm not quite sure I understand all the ramifications of the technological singularity via AI, and you know, the whole idea that the machines will combine as superintelligence and be more important. And what's the moment where we cross that barrier and become immortalized and things like that? The nature of death and dying has been changing. So I am not quite sure there is a singular moment at which this happens, as much as a gradual process which is already underway. You mentioned longevity. Longevity is not quite immortality, but in comparison with what it was several generations ago, it's almost, in terms of scale, more than double what it used to be. So it's not immortal in that sense, but longevity has, of course, changed how we understand our definitions of life itself, isn't it? So it's not just a question of extension of life as a singular event. I mean, I find the idea of singularity not quite enough when we think about that. When we talk about, say, enhancement or of consciousness or thinking or intelligence, we are already moving ahead on the singularity path, aren't we? Maybe not crossing over, but moving along anyway. That progression, I think, is important. So the singularity, when it happens as a great event in history or historical time with a particular, I think we are always already being prepared for that slide towards that kind of condition, shared condition, where a different form of life is already underway. Yeah, so it's not quite a singularity as much as a set of, as a continuum, I would say.
Yeah, sure. I guess like with AI, what's interesting is currently AI is very good at sort of correlating big data together and being very good at making predictions. And we've been able to develop AI just with mere, I guess, brute force correlations and some neat tricks to train AIs to be able to beat the best players in Go and to create chess programs that trash all other chess programs that have been created before without being told what to do. But what it can't do, what AI is not very good at the moment, is advanced causative thinking. So there are some projects at the moment that are focusing on trying to fill in the gaps as to what's required to achieve machine understanding, which I'd sort of say is you know, not just intelligence, but something more than just mere brute force intelligence or brute force correlation and prediction. So that's interesting. But yeah.
Okay, I should catch up on that. That's not really anything I'm very familiar with at this point. Yeah, but yes.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you: is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you think would be important
Good God, you
contribute to the debate?
You run the entire range, I would think, from literature to artificial intelligence. Now, I was thinking maybe I'll spend a couple of minutes talking about what literature can do, and not talk about just the art, like the tissue arts projects, Symbiotica and things like that. But I think if you go back to texts like Octavia Butler's, I think there's already a posthumanist vision there. And it's a useful vision in the sense of what we have been talking about. I mean, Savulescu, James Hughes, and the Sandberg, of course, the really big names in posthuman thought. And I'm not categorizing them as transhumanist, posthuman, things like that. I'm just putting them all together in one, maybe violently, but yes. But I think the literature does offer a lot of deep thinking on these subjects, especially in terms of the kinds of characters that are created for us. literature, by definition, as Gary Harpham said, is devoted to thinking about the other. You know, it's the one field where you hold the thought of the other in your head. People unlike us, people different from us. And the ethical engagement with difference that literature foregrounds, I think, is central to how we can popularize, think about, critique posthumanism itself. So I think literature will play, and I'm not speaking just because I teach literature for a living. I mean, I do that. But I think literature does offer you ways of talking about the other, which, say, previous generations did not think about. So the sympathy, empathy, connection with alterity, difference, that literature offers, by saying literature by definition is interested in the other. And several people, philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, novelists like Octavia Butler, critics like Jeffrey Gart Harpham have all spoken about this. Our interest in difference and the other is important for us to engage with posthumanism. So I think literature will play a major role if we are to think of either endorsing or critiquing or doing a bit of both for posthumanism. So yeah, I wanted to end with that.
Well, it's been wonderful having you on the show, Pramod. I really appreciate you spending the time. And I found your book very fascinating. I'll put some links in the description of this video so people easily be able to find it, as well as the article you wrote. So yeah, it's been wonderful. So thank you very much for
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Bye.